Hi, and welcome to Minerva's latest coverage on the 2021 UK proxy season. Our analysts have been hard at work digging through the developments of this proxy season so far and have brought together some key findings for us to share with you today. Minerva provides trustworthy data and insightful reporting for sustainable stewardship. My name is Alex Whitebrook, ESG Communications Manager at Minerva Analytics, and I'm joined today by Minerva CEO Sarah Wilson and Stewardship Director Fran Lopez de Sá, two experts in the field of proxy voting with over 25 years of experience between them. Today, they'll be presenting the latest trends based on data gathered from the proxy season so far and specifically focused on the initial findings from the FTSE 350. We'll give Sarah and Fran time each to present their analysis of the latest trends, followed by 15 minutes to address questions from the audience, so please start getting them in as soon as you can. To get us started, I'll be handing over to Sarah to give us the high-level introduction to this proxy season and the longer-term history. Over to you, Sarah.
Alex, thanks very much indeed for that introduction. So welcome everybody. And we were digging around in the data earlier today and we found that the first proxy voting results data that we collected was as far back as February 1996. And in fact, one of the very first resolutions that we were looking at was for Shell Transport and Trading for the production of a CSR report. So it just goes to show that some 25 years later, we're still talking about the same issues. And I'm not sure if that's a good or a bad thing. So the first four slides that we're going to look at are some high-level introductory information to look at the turnover in terms of the response to AGMs, the participation levels, and look at some of the key highlights of the season. So first, some backdrop. Remember, a well-diversified global investor has got a very, very busy proxy season to contend with. This is the AGM season last year, and this actually shows the spread of the workload that typical investors are coping with around the world. Now, this is something to bear in mind because disclosures are growing ever more complex, and this is only going to have more and more impact on dialogue. And while virtual AGMs have been lauded as a solution for that, it doesn't really help the problem of the low quality of data in terms particularly of climate change data and ESG data, and the bunching, which really is problematic. So here we can see, when we started back in 1996, turnover levels were, would you believe, sub 30%. In the UK market. And with the advent of reviews such as the Miners Review, which were encouraging more investors to vote, we have seen turnover gradually increase. So over the last 10 years or so, we can see there has been an increase. I'm not too worried about seeing the 2021 dip there. We're not yet through the full AGM season. Yes, the December 31st year ends are all in, but we've also got the Junes and the Septembers. So there is still plenty of time yet to see what the full year review is going to be. So pretty much steady as investors have become globalized and where markets require mandatory voting, we have definitely seen a sharp uptick over the years. In the top 350 companies, we have definitely seen a marked increase as time has gone by. And in the full report, we will also be covering the small caps as well so that you can see the differences there. So looking at the average and the median, and this tends to be similar regardless of resolutions. So when people are voting, they're voting across all of the resolutions as well. Are we going to get up any higher than that? Personally, I don't think so. You still have to consider the fact there's a lot of retail shareholders who have been pretty much disenfranchised from voting. You'll also find that there are shares out on loan, for example, or where there are people who are just disinterested in voting. And as an organisation, we do not support mandatory voting on the part of institutional investors because mandatory voting does not necessarily guarantee a high quality vote. So here's the snapshot. Here's what we can actually see is coming through. So 12 rejected board resolutions. This is actually pretty rare in this market where we see the majority of votes, the majority of the time are getting massive majority support. We've got 4 shareholder resolutions, 3 of which were linked to climate change, which is quite a difference from last year. But what we can see from this is that shareholders are overwhelmingly supportive of management, and that the average dissent across all resolutions was a mere 3.1%. So that's the initial snapshot. What I'm going to do now is turn to our Stewardship Director, Fran Lopez de Sá, and he's actually going to be talking through in a little bit more detail the findings. So Fran, over to you. What do you think about this? What do you think is behind the detail of this?
Thank you, Sarah. So looking at the 12 proposals that were voted on during this year, there are two main categories on here. First of all, there will be capital authorities linked to this application of preemption rights, which represent almost half of the defeated resolutions. And this is mainly because there are special resolutions, and in those cases, they didn't achieve sufficient majority. On the other hand, we have the executive compensation, in particular remuneration report, non-binding resolutions, which we'll be covering in more detail later on in the conversation.
Okay, thanks for that. So we've actually got the breakout here. Hopefully everybody can see those. So just to let everybody know, Minerva has its own taxonomy of shareholder resolutions. By that, I mean we have categories and subcategories of all the different types of resolutions. Those are very closely aligned, for example, to OECD and ICGN principles. And we, in addition, have a lot of analytical data points. Now, one of the things that jumps out off the page for me, Fran, is yet again, remuneration seems to be dominating the resolutions. Why do you think that is? Are we just going through some kind of rinse and repeat cycle on remuneration?
Sure. Early in 2020, large investors and other market players did warn companies regarding pandemic-related pay actions, that they would be scrutinized. Lack of explanation and rationale in pay adjustments are likely normally to drive high dissent from shareholders. So more and more investors are taking into account ESG-related concerns, and this year we clearly see the impact on remuneration.
Okay, so when you say a rationale, what do you mean by that exactly? Perhaps you could just explain very quickly what that means.
So when the company in particular, remuneration committee made a decision to adjust the final remuneration to be paid to executive directors, and investors and shareholders would expect a full explanation of the company on the decision. That would be a rationale.
Okay, that's great. So having a look at slide 6 here, we've got a closer look actually at the different types of dissent that are coming up. By the way, when we talk about dissent, we are looking at the aggregate of against votes and those votes which have been positively abstained, positively withheld from the company to demonstrate that there is not support. Fran, can you just quickly talk us through those different breakouts here?
So the remuneration category includes the approval of the remuneration report, as well as the remuneration policy, incentive plans, and director fees. Mm-hmm. We have seen an increase on shareholder dissent on remuneration, in particular for 2021, where we have seen, compared to the previous year, a significant increase to 8.3%.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Looking at the defeated remuneration report and policies, we have 3 companies in the sample that they got the remuneration report defeated this year. The first one was Informa with 62.1% against. The payable at Informa was in relation to the targets set under the executive bonus scheme, which were not considered to be sufficiently challenging. Additionally, Minerva research has also found that there were significant concerns with the quantum of the remuneration package. We have also the Rio Tinto that it put through a remuneration report resolution under the UK and the Australian law, and both of the resolutions were defeated. Although the company performed well during the year, investors still rejected the remuneration report due to the total pay received by the former CEO, who resigned over the destruction of sacred shelters in Australia in 2020.
So this would seem to suggest that remuneration committees are maybe not listening to their shareholders about their concerns, because we see names coming up again and again, sort of repeat offenders.
Yes, that's correct. And Morrison was one of the repeated offenders. The remuneration is discretion this year to award bosses big bonuses despite missing profit targets and ignoring costs related to the pandemic.
Okay, so you mentioned about rationales, etc. Do you just want to quickly talk listeners through maybe a little bit about the Minerva ratings and how we approach these issues?
Sure. So we provide a remuneration score for the companies we analyzed, and based on the remuneration practices, we look at the alignment of the remuneration package with the shareholder interest, as well as the quantum of the package. So we can quickly see for the three companies that they've received a high dissent, in fact defeated remuneration report votes this year, they have been awarded a rather poor grade by Minerva this year, in particular Informa with an E. So we have seen over the years a clear correlation between executive compensation, Minerva ratings, and shareholder dissent. So,
okay,
Sarah, what are your views on correlation and causation issues with the advisors?
This is a really hot button issue. And I think companies sometimes get a little bit too obsessed about a singular recommendation and they miss the nuance that's associated with the underlying data points. Increasingly, shareholders have their own voting policies and they use proxy research as an input into their process. So I would say to every issuer, you actually need to go back and look at your shareholders' actual policies and see what the triggers are, because it isn't always to do with the quantum. It can be dilution. There can also be issues of fairness, for example. So we've seen that, say, with policies on a pension, for example. But it is very, very difficult to produce a really tight correlation and causation. Different markets have different approaches to doing these things, but certainly the larger shareholders would be really quite upset, because I know that particularly those who've got large stewardship teams are engaging with their investee companies and providing feedback, and we see the headlines about that all the time. So I think it's sometimes used as a fig leaf to cover some embarrassment, but it is not a substitute for engaging with the shareholders directly.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. So the second category that received the highest dissent was director elections. So the average dissent on director election has been slowly increased since 2015 and in recent years. Although the number of resolutions with high dissent has decreased to 41 so far this year, compared to 85 during 2020, as we can see in the graph.
I think that's really fascinating, Fran, because you've just actually said 2050 since 2015. This seems to be taking a long time to address this issue. Is this something that worries you?
We can see the evolution of the proxy voting policies on investors, that they are trying to hold directors accountable for particular issues and more ESG related issues, which is positive. It is a slow process. We have seen that. Yeah.
I mean, obviously, we can't say, oh, well, it was definitely diversity that tipped the balance on this. Remember, people, we're looking at the data indicators that would tend to suggest versus the shareholders' policies, what were the overwhelming factors associated with the board disclosures there. But in terms of what we can draw, the parallels we can draw from this, it's taken diversity a very long time to become such a hot button issue. Now, actually, this is one of these older issues. I mean, we've been tracking this since 1996 in terms of board diversity. What do you think this is actually going to mean in terms of, for example, climate change reporting and accountability? Do you think that we should be really concerned?
I mean, hopefully the market evolves in the same thing that diversity did. As you said, it's taking a very long time. I was pleasantly surprised that 3 of the directors with high dissent this year were in relation to diversity and particularly female representation on the board. So hopefully we can get to that point with climate change as well, where there is a director accountable for lack of action on the corporate side on climate change.
Yes, I did notice, for example, Legal and General, LGIM, actually announcing that they were so unhappy with the lack of progress across a number of dimensions that they were divesting substantial portions of their portfolio. And indeed, yesterday, I think that BlackRock announced a significant tilting in their benchmark indexes to take account of more ESG issues. So what do you think the message is for issuers here on this?
In terms of the holding the director accountable, I think is slightly complicated with the level of data provided to determine which director is accountable for it. Mm-hmm. So the divestment position that you're talking about is slightly different from the proxy voting perspective.
So I think for issuers then it's a case of listening to what shareholders are actually saying, because the consequences are either there are going to be getting significant voting increases and dissenting votes, or ultimately the complete sanction of divestment. So we've got a number of issues here. So are investors communicating clearly enough? Are companies taking the votes seriously, or are directors and maybe the non-executive directors, maybe they're not understanding the message that they are receiving through the ballot box? Okay, yeah. So I'm going to move forward now to to slide 9, which is the shareholder resolutions. Fran, what do you think about this?
The shareholder resolution. So we can talk about a few takeaways from this section. And the first one is the environmental and social issues, in particular climate change, as we already discussed. They are top of the agenda. So there are stark difference between markets. However, between January and June 2021, there were over 3,300 shareholder proposals in the S&P 500, compared to only 4 in the FTSE 350. So the first half of 2021 saw 4 of the top UK 350 companies with such a proposals on the agenda. And this compares to 29 shareholder proposals in the whole of 2020. Whilst various ESG-related shareholder proposals has been successful in the US market, only board-backed resolutions have passed in the UK. So we have seen all shareholder resolutions voted down.
That's a significant difference, and it's something that certainly we've been reflecting on as we've been going through the season. In the US, we've seen different approaches to how people approach ESG frameworks. It's been a much more highly politicized environment. What we also see is that the ease of putting shareholder proposals in the US is significantly less complicated than it is in the UK, for instance. Mm-hmm. But of course, the interesting thing is that most people don't realize is that shareholder resolutions in the US are what are technically known as precatory. They are pleading, they are non-binding, they are suggestions, whereas resolutions in the UK are for the most part binding resolutions. So they are actually a very, very powerful tool, but very, very rarely used. So the most interesting thing here, though, Fran, that I thought was it's where management is supporting that resolution, mm-hmm. Then shareholders are getting support. So I think my takeaway from this is that boards, do get a lot of support at the ballot box, even though there might be quite lively debate and criticism of some of the disclosures. Ultimately, the boards do get the backing of the shareholders. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's very significant that only board-backed resolutions have passed in the UK market.
So what do you think, in terms of, do we think that sometimes maybe the issuers, the dialogue, if it's going on, we keep repeating remuneration sent over and over and over again. Mm-hmm. Is there a problem with people kicking the can down the road on this? And do you think that we might see an uptick in sort of lack of support on things like the climate resolutions going forward? Bearing in mind the net zero objectives, it's not long to 2030. If we're still talking about it in 5, 6, 7 years time, then that's really problematic.
Yes, I mean, something that we have also seen is the in relation to climate change related resolution is the board putting themselves the resolution and the strategy up for shareholder approval this year in particular. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves over time as well. Something that I wanted to flag up as well is in terms of the US market. It is true the ESG related shareholder proposals have been more successful, but the result is not always what shareholders looking for. At the end of the day, shareholders and the resolutions are not binding. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, even though the resolutions are passed, there is no reaction from the company.
Yeah, and of course, this is now leading the SEC to consider a new framework. One of the other issues, a new framework for disclosures. Of course, what we mustn't also forget, the UK regulatory frameworks are different in that we actually do have a Climate Change Act. We have a number of diversity regulations. We have the Shareholder Rights Directive. So we actually have a legislative environment which is actually much more supportive and less politicized at sort of when it gets into practice. Whereas, as we've seen before the change of the last administration in the US, a particularly negative and hostile approach to ESG. Whereas I think the thing that I would take away from the UK is the dialogue may be fractious at times, but people do seem to be willing to get together to negotiate solutions.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. So one of the things that we've talked about, we mentioned a little bit earlier, is the fact that we've actually got a vast trove of data going back 25 years. I thought it would be useful just to pop in here as quick screenshots of the online voting results data set that we have, where people can actually query and screen the voting results data and download that. And particularly for our academic clients and people doing deep dive research, those are actually available as data feeds, which can then be connected to the underlying data points. So there's a lot of papers actually have been produced, if you go through SSRN, have actually been produced with our data over time. So I think that the pretty much unbroken record of voting results, I think, is something that we're particularly proud of. So if anybody would like to have a demo of the platform, then of course you can get in touch with us at the end. So Fran, we talked about the race to zero. I know that you've been looking very closely at climate resolutions, climate change resolutions and action, because of the work that we've been doing with our new ESG data sets. Could you just talk us through what you're seeing here on the climate resolutions and specifically some targeted companies?
Yeah. So climate change accounted for 3 of the 4 shareholder resolutions voted on this year at the UK top 350 companies. And none of the climate proposals were successful, as we previously mentioned, and receiving an average support rate of 20.57%, which I still think that is significant. So we have looked at companies in the 350 that are also part of the Climate Action 100 Plus, an investor-led initiative that to ensure that the world's largest corporate greenhouse gas emitters take necessary action on climate change. So looking at the constituents of the 350, only 4% are in this list. And looking at the resolutions that they have been proposed this year, climate change related, we can see that all the companies with a climate change related resolution are on this list, apart from the 2 financial institutions, Barclays and HSBC. One with a shareholder proposal and the other one proposed by management that was approved. It is Worth noting that the three shareholders, the management proposals have been passed, whereas the shareholder proposed resolutions have not.
So we've long been great supporters of shareholders having a say on sustainability. And I did hear that I think it's National Grid is actually going to be putting forward its own resolution on its net zero ambitions in the coming weeks. So I think this is going to be something that we need to take a look at, because in terms of the companies who have got the biggest part to play, for many investors, the real challenge is we know that what is disclosed in an annual report or a proxy statement isn't necessarily the full picture of what is going on inside the company. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the annual reports are really suboptimal, aren't they?
I mean, absolutely. But that's an issue that we are on the outside, and I'm talking about the outside when I'm referring to the relationship between the company and the investor. It's difficult to take an objective view when you are not in the conversation that the engagement exercise they're having with one another. So it's difficult to get the full picture if they don't provide the data for it.
Yeah. And I think there's been a lot of criticism from regulators and from investors about the quality of data that's being disclosed, because we often see large volumes of what we call verbiage, but often very light on actual facts. And so I think, what's useful for shareholders is to have hard facts, which that they know have been verified and audited. So that investors can factor that into their valuation models, and also factor that into their engagement. Because, of course, we're not just talking about fund managers here. We also have asset owners, pension schemes, many of whom now have legal obligations to provide reports back down to savers, long-term savers, about where the risks are in their portfolios. Climate is clearly a risk for the portfolio. And we've got some real communication gaps in the ownership chain between the issuer and the fund manager, between the fund manager and the asset owner. So it's really difficult to manage risks when you have not got the right data. So I know that you've also been looking at two of the most significant frameworks, which have gained traction. Fran, can you just talk us through slide 12 here and what this is about?
So the sustainability team here at Minerva collect data on two leading frameworks in the ESG space: TCFD, looking at climate-related financial disclosures, and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We can see that in both cases, approximately 2/3 of the FTSE 350 make clear reference to these frameworks in their disclosure. Now, why are TCFD and SDG relevant in this context, Sarah?
Well, obviously, TCFD, Financial Stability Board, is the backer behind TCFD, and it recognised that climate is potentially has a major impact on financial stability. And Mark Carney, since he left the Bank of England, has been basically on a grand tour around the world trying to get financial regulators to embed TCFD principles into disclosures. And as COP26 approaches, I think we can expect more of that. What I find so disappointing with this is TCFD is not new. And actually, a lot of it's not rocket science, but you've still got 1/4 of people not disclosing against it. Now, those companies will likely have pension schemes. Those pension schemes have now got obligations to make TCFD disclosures themselves. So we've got a gap that we need to close for that, because clearly pensions need to be paid not just next week, next month, next quarter, but in 25 years' time. And I think Nest have talked this a lot. You've got 16-year-olds going in saving now. They want to be able to make sure that they've got a comfortable retirement, and there's two dimensions of comfort, because if you're a pensioner in the northwest part of Canada at the moment and you're basking in 45, 50 degree temperatures, that's not going to be a comfortable retirement. So there are the significant existential risks that need to be factored in. The Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, I think people often forget there is a connection between climate and many of the other dimensions of sustainable growth. You can't just look at climate change in isolation without thinking about what the work impacts are. And of course, we saw that the announcement this morning of the gigafactory in the north of England. Green jobs are coming into the market to replace sort of the old petrochemical jobs, which I think is good. But the Sustainable Development Goals, also not new. They've been around for about 5 years now. And I think it is an opportunity for people to get away from the idea that ESG is all about you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do the other. But actually, this is how in the circular economy, finance plays such an important part to high quality company growth, but also the social dimension, jobs for workers, sustainable returns for pensioners, etc.
Yeah, and so, that's a little bit the spirit of the SDGs, right? The interconnection among the 17 goals.
Absolutely. Thinking holistically about stewardship. And of course, that's why the Stewardship Code in the UK now is a much more holistic document, thinking about things in the broader sense. So we have absolutely galloped through the results so far. And obviously, there is a much more detailed report to come. And so we asked the question, is this the most ESG focused season? And the conclusion that we had is, while we've seen COVID-19 and Build Back Better dominating the financial headlines, this has not yet necessarily been reflected through in stewardship. And I think there is a concern here because we're Section 172 of the Companies Act are talking about fairness between stakeholders and shareholders, and how people can be working in partnership. There is a little bit of a concern here that we're still not seeing the disclosures that investors need. This is not want, this is need. But we've also got a difference between the UK and the rest of the world, which could be potentially a good difference, because we've already got regulation in place which is encouraging and supporting the movement towards these disclosures. It could be that the timing is such that people have been talking about these things, but companies haven't yet had a chance to react and to put these disclosures in place, but also that there are potentially big cultural differences between the way that UK governance and stewardship works and the rest of the world. Either way, COP26, you've got implementation statements, stewardship code, mandatory reporting. I think that is going to result in more changes for the 2022 season, when hopefully we will see higher quality disclosures being made on these issues. So those are the key takeaways, I think, from our perspective. Now, there is a full briefing, which is going to be ready. I think it's towards the end of July, but we did want to get the immediate highlights out to people. But I think that Alex now wants to turn the floor over to Q&A. Alex, you're on mute.
You are still on mute, Alex.
Okay, you can hear me now, yeah?
Yes.
A fantastic ending to a fantastic presentation there, hey? Thank you very much, Sarah and Fran, for your comments. It was really great to get an insider's perspective on what's been going on this proxy season. And if anyone does have any questions, please do pop them through now into the chat. I'll be keeping an eye on that. But I also have some questions here for Sarah and Fran to kind of reflect a little deeper on what's been going on this proxy season. We talked a little bit about comparing the UK to US proxy season, the new developments both from the SEC and with the Stewardship Code here in the UK. But I'm sure a lot of people are wondering, Sarah and Fran, what is the difference between the UK and Europe proxy voting trends from what we've seen so far?
Good one. The biggest difference that we see is it takes a lot longer for other markets to disclose their data. One of the big differences is that the UK market and the US market have basically got into a routine of disclosing the results really very, very quickly. In a much more standardized format, which I think is something that shareholders really appreciate. But oftentimes in overseas markets, you still get very poor disclosure in terms of, well, everything was passed on a show of hands, but wait for the minutes. And then the minutes is a sort of 150-page document, and buried in there are the results themselves. So we do encourage companies to get the results out as quickly as possible, because asset managers have to report to the asset owners, the providers of capital, as to what has actually been going on. And bearing in mind that, you know, trades are settled in 48 hours these days, it really isn't rocket science to get the voting results data out. To say, genuinely, there is a real need for this information. The fund managers have to disclose to their clients what's been going on, because they've been charged with stewardship as a responsibility, and it helps everybody plan for engagement and dialogue. So you need to just get the results out much quicker.
Yeah, I would like to add that it's not only the timeliness in terms of when you get the results out, is whether you're going to get them or not. Because in some European countries, they don't even bother. They would say whether they are passed or not, if you're lucky enough.
Which is really a breach of the Shareholder Rights Directive 1, let's not forget. So I only hope that Brexit won't get in the way of ESMA thinking that it actually ought to do some follow-up on this.
That is really a good point. I think that there's, despite the delays that we see in some other countries in Europe, do you think that going forward, both in Europe and here in the UK, there will be an added focus on ESG from a proxy voting perspective in the near future? Is that trend going to continue?
I would say so. I say that more and more ESG consideration are being taken to the proxy voting side of things. So as we were talking earlier about the female representation on the board, for example, you know, now investors are taking accountable. For example, the chairman or the chair of the nomination committee, when there is an acceptable level of female representation on the board, and hopefully that can move forward when the data gets better as well, to ethnic diversity, perhaps, or many other ESG related resolutions. But it's very much down to the quality of the data as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, we have seen, for example, markets like Spain and France over the years. I think France is one of the markets that actually was putting forward some really high, the Loi Grenelle, for example, really did encourage some very, very good disclosures. And then a couple of years ago, we saw Spanish annual reports literally explode in size. All I would say to issuers is, the volume is not necessarily as important as the quality of the metrics. Now, obviously, that leads us into a number of debates about competing frameworks and the battle of the frameworks. And it's good that IFRS and GAAP are now grappling with these issues. I do worry, though, that people think there is a one-size-fits-all model for ESG, because, of course, for the last 10 years, we've all been told there's no such thing as one-size-fits-all governance. So I'm not sure why we would suddenly think one-size-fits-all is good for ESG. The UK hasn't yet started on its own work on the taxonomy, and it looks as though there is some movement on the EU taxonomy. So I think for any company secretaries or investor relations people watching, you've just got to keep on your toes and just watch the frameworks closely. But tell your story, tell it succinctly. Think about tagging data in your annual reports. Help investors. There are always complaints about, oh, well, inaccurate voting recommendations. Well, you should try reading inaccurate annual reports, and annual reports where the data just doesn't make sense or seems to have been written by 6 different people. There is a long way that we can all go to make this process much easier for the providers of capital.
Excellent point. That really wraps things up fairly well, but I do have one last question here, just asking each of you to help our viewers understand and highlight the difference between the shareholder proposal perspective versus having a bespoke voting policy and how that can benefit investors?
Sure. So a bespoke voting policy, many of the voting policies that have been around for quite some time now, for example, the OECD principles, most people know about that. They date back to a time before people were really thinking about ESG. So we are expecting a lot of people are going to be reviewing their voting policies this year. And there are a number of reasons for that. It's not just the sort of the imminent arrival of COP and TCFD, but it's the increased focus on long-term sustainable returns and understanding that risk is a much broader issue than it maybe was historically constructed. So just having a check the box ticks minimum voting policy. For example, if you're a fund manager and you're trying to sell an ESG fund, but your voting is not reflected in that whole approach, it's a marketing issue. You're not going to be able to say hand on heart that you are an ESG investor if your voting policy doesn't actually follow your investment thesis. So I think that's actually something that's going to change a lot. Fran, I don't know if you've got any thoughts about there being more shareholder resolutions.
Yeah, I was going to take a slightly different approach to answer your question, Alex, in terms of the, what I have seen so far in terms of how investor approach or implement ESG into the proxy voting is through shareholder proposals normally. And that's how they incorporate that angle or dimension into their policies. However, I don't think that that's enough, and they should take a step forward. And some of them, they're already doing it. And we have seen that with our clients, particularly the more the ones that they are slightly advanced in sustainability. They would like to add that ESG dimension into the proxy voting in a stronger manner, let's say. So, for example, if a company is not disclosing Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, then we're going to vote against the accounts, for example. Or if you are expecting a company to comply with a particular framework, let's say TCFD, and they're not doing so, then you can do exactly the same thing, or even hold the chairman of the board accountable for not taking care of what is expected from the investor side.
So you're talking there about a real ratcheting up, Fran, of sort of using the tools that are already there, rather than actually sort of, the publicity that might be got from a shareholder resolution that's non-binding, that it actually might be more powerful for shareholders to use the existing tools that they've got. One of the things we've not touched on, which I think would be quite remiss, is to talk about the role of what some people call passive investors or index investors. Fran, have you got any thoughts about why index investors should be using their votes more carefully?
Well, at the end of the day, passive investors, they invest in the whole index, as it was said. So they definitely should use the vote, because their vote will make a difference in the outcome. Okay,
so you can't sell it, so you may as well vote it. I think it is what you're saying.
Yeah, that would be the headline.
Okay, so use it or lose it, and being a so-called passive investor, well, indexing is really not passive at all, because depending on the strategy that's actually being deployed, it's about joining everything up. So I think the takeaway, Alex, for us is think holistically, think in sort of a circular way, think about how all these things come together, think about the data, think about how the standards all work, because of course we do want, every vote, we'd love to think it was 100% of the time, but I think any level of dissent tends to indicate some kind of failure of dialogue somewhere along the way. So our work is not yet done, I think, is the key takeaway here.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for wrapping things up nice and neatly there. I'll put an end to the discussion then for now, and we can continue the discussion elsewhere. If anyone would like to get in touch with us and with Minerva to have a further discussion about what we can help you discover about the UK proxy season, then please do get in touch at hello@minerva.info. You can also download the briefing below and there's going to be a further detailed briefing coming out later this month. So do keep in touch and keep an eye out for those things there. Brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone.
Very much.